Received wisdom regarding the Fallout series these days seems to be that with Bethesda's acquisition of the license, the series suffered a dumbing down. The original Fallout games developed by Interplay were isometric CRPGs that foregrounded player choice and consequence. Fallout 3 was a betrayal of that open-ended spirit, trading complexity for spectacle and the gimmick of 3D gameplay. I see this as an example of revisionist history. It overlooks the fact that games in the style of Fallout 1 and 2, like Baldur's Gate or the critically lauded Planescape Torment, suffered a huge drop in popularity in the 90s. As technology moved on and taste changed, those games began to feel like relics of a bygone age. Only recently, with massive successes like Baldur's Gate 3 and Pillars of Eternity, has the genre seen a huge resurgence. Gamers at the turn of the century wanted a more immersive visual experience, and Bethesda, acquiring the license from struggling developer Interplay, delivered on that. The post-apocalyptic wasteland of Fallout had never looked this good, or felt this immersive. And while I would be one of those who put player agency and meaningful choice before visual flair in RPGs, I would have been back then, and still am today, in the minority. The vast majority of players want something simpler, more immediate and easier to understand, and it seems clear to me that the reason for Fallout's continued popularity is because Bethesda found a way to package and present the uniquely compelling world of Fallout to the masses. I think it's fairly likely that, had this not happened, we would be talking about Fallout in the same breath as the Ultimate series. Great games, but a product of their time, a fondly remembered part of gaming history, but a relic. Instead, there are legions of Fallout fans who have never played those games and who started their journey through the wasteland with Fallout 3, who eagerly await the next entry in the series and pore over episodes of the TV show for inconsistencies. Make no mistake, Fallout 3, for all its faults, is the game that launched this franchise into the stratosphere. Not as characterful and complex as New Vegas, another point of received wisdom these days, and that is true, but Fallout 3 is the more significant game. The Empire Strikes Back, for instance, is widely seen as the best entry in the Star Wars saga, the one that deepens the character, fleshes out the universe, but it would not exist without the original Star Wars. Yet in returning to Fallout 3, I was struck by just how well it holds up. It's not simply a flawed precursor, but a compelling open-world RPG in its own right. And there are choices here, plenty of them. Not as nuanced as RPG devotees might like. You're generally faced with the good choice or the evil choice. There are a few shades of grey, but you're never compelled to simply follow the story as written. There is never just one outcome. You can become the saviour of Megaton, the first town you encounter after you leave the vault, or blow the place to smithereens. In fact, doing the right thing often requires the player to think carefully about what they're doing. There are several quests in the game that, if you blindly follow all the prompts, lead you to doing something morally reprehensible. For these sorts of quests, there's sometimes no clear counterpoint, a good NPC that gives you the virtuous option. You simply have to decide not to take them any further, or you turn the gun on the quest giver, so to speak. This could lead to you being ostracized from a town or an encampment turning hostile, but you're allowed to do it. Your experience of where the safe zones are and who the enemy is can vary greatly between playthroughs. Returning after such a long time, I was also struck by just how bleak the landscape is. The trend with the Fallout games, peaking with 76, has been for things to get brighter, more colourful over time. Gazing across the desolation of the capital wasteland, it's quite sobering. Even the most obvious points of interest barely rise above that ruined expanse. There is no doubt when you leave the vault that the world of Fallout 3, even if it ditches the morally grey choice, will be a relentless slog through this greying, burnt-out landscape. It's very open compared to my experience of playing more recent Bethesda RPG. Skyrim's landscape, for instance, seems incredibly directed by comparison, with paths through the forests and natural funnels through the mountains clear to the player. The game's direct successor, Fallout 4, is a lot more condensed, with landmarks to navigate by. You're never really far from a road in that game. Fallout 3, on the other hand, has the player leaning heavily on the map and quest markers for direction, and in that sense it's a reminder of what people mean when they talk about stumbling across incident and action in Bethesda games. Strike out in a direction, and on the way you will stumble across things, but more so in Fallout 3 than the later games, because it's quite hard to see anything of note on the horizon until you get up quite close. Then the figurative fog of desolation clears and you're able to make out shacks and ruined buildings where inhabitants of the wasteland eke out a living, that friend or foe, they seem to emerge from the grey morass, and you can see that, there are people there. It's quite hard to divorce yourself, of course, from the time in which you're playing a game, and arguably that's not the point of a retrospective review. I would argue that. The question is, what is the game like to play now within the context of all the games that have come out since, or that we may be playing today? To preface my overall thoughts, there is more interest and intrigue in the first dozen or so hours of Fallout 3 than in the entirety of Bethesda's most recent offering, Starfield. Genres evolve and tastes change, but the sense of exploration and the unknown must surely be at the core of a Bethesda RPG. You never know what might be over the crest of the next hill, and you're compelled to explore in a way that you never feel like doing in Starfield, because there's really nothing of note or incident to discover. It's everywhere in Fallout 3. Everything in the game is in-engine, by which I mean dramatic moments or story beats are played out with NPCs that all have a set of behaviours associated with them. For instance, towards the end of the game, there's this sequence where you have to escort a group of scientists to safety. This group moves through several locations in real time, reacting to whatever creatures they encounter and to the player's behaviour. Stray shots can turn them hostile or cause them to enter an endless loop in which they're fleeing but never progressing. It's madness to attempt such a pivotal story moment with all these AI scripts running concurrently, and could lead to complete chaos, but it also lends the game a realism that a more controlled sequence or even a cutscene would circumvent. Similarly, there are several instances where NPCs move from place to place, sometimes across a large chunk of the map. They will physically walk there, interacting with whatever they encounter along the way, and the player has the choice to either keep pace with them or fast travel to their eventual location, at which point they will usually have teleported and be waiting. It can be immersion breaking when something ridiculous happens and the AI gets confused, but then again, what game would even attempt something like this today? Not very many, and certainly nothing AAA. You only have to look at Starfield to see how contained and predictable even random encounters are in that game. These systems are all far too risky for a modern AAA game to attempt. The fact that they're in Fallout 3 gives the game a sense of unpredictability that I quite enjoy in retrospect, particularly since I now know, and most players know, how to remedy issues that crop up through console commands or mods. But you can see where Bethesda's reputation for putting out janky games where crazy things happen comes from with Fallout 3. NPCs have routines, they go to bed, eat, sleep, have conversations, which further leads to either the sense of immersion or player frustration when you can't find that one NPC you need because you don't know their routine or where they'll be. Again, I'm sorry to keep harping on Starfield, but the NPCs in that game rarely have occasion to move or any reason not to be standing there waiting for the player character to approach them. Nothing like a routine or a day-night cycle that might dictate their behaviour. Is that better or worse? On balance, I would say it's worse, because so much emergent gameplay, that illusion of reality and craziness, is lost. If nothing ever changes, no one moves. Is the combat actually fun? It's a lot better than I was expecting, to be honest, having internalized the notion that the gameplay in Bethesda games has gradually improved over time. That's, again, received wisdom. It's not as smooth as an FPS, but there is far less of the disconnect associated with dice rolls under the hood that you get with something like Morrowind. If you're on target, you will hit every time, but the amount of damage you do and the effectiveness of attacks is tied to your stats. Criticals are particularly satisfying when the cinematic camera kicks in. And after playing Fallout 3 again, I've done a complete 180 in my opinion of V.A.T.S. I used to think it was a stopgap between dice-based combat of traditional RPGs and FPS. Basically, a way to keep the traditionalists on board as we try and kind of wean them off that and get them to enjoy the shooter combat. Now I feel like it's actually something different. It's an interesting alternative, an option you can use in a pinch, or simply a way to break up the flow of combat, peppering in these cinematic decisions that you can make to blow off a super mutant's leg or knock the gun out of their hand. I think if you go into the game expecting the combat to be absolute dog shit like I was, you might be pleasantly surprised. Even if not, it's hardly the worst combat system in the world. You also have plenty of options: melee, ranged, heavy weapons, light weapons, laser weaponry, grenades, mines, the latter of which can be used strategically in the early game to tackle mobs that are beyond your level. In short, the combat won't blow you away, but it isn't half as bad as people make out. In terms of the amount of bang for your buck, I had forgotten just how massive the game is. For this review, I set myself the task of completing the main story, which took me 23 hours. And I know, recalling previous playthroughs that I've done of the game, I've barely scratched the surface of the world. Head out in any direction, you are guaranteed to run into something that will kick off another quest chain, if not that, a random event that forces you into action. One of my favourite moments, which seemed quintessentially Fallout, was when I was heading for this abandoned church, only to be confronted by a panicked civilian being pursued by a raider that was on fire. Having just watched the TV show, I can imagine Lucy McLean completely dumbstruck by the madness unfolding in front of her eyes. You can think of this game as a relic of its time, destined to be improved upon narratively with New Vegas and mechanically with Fallout 4. But I prefer to think of it as just hugely ambitious for its time, an unrealistic attempt to make a world that feels real. It doesn't manage that, but what game does, ultimately? And the way things are going with AAA, I don't see any studio taking the kinds of risks Bethesda was taking with this incredibly ambitious game. It's not a simulation, but it's a good facsimile of one, whilst also accommodating that directed story content. It's here that the game mostly falls flat for me. For the central story to work, you would have to really feel a connection with your absentee father, or at least empathise with him, but the character, voiced by Liam Neeson, always comes across as cold and dispassionate, even though the game is at pains to emphasise his selflessness and sacrifice. The dialogue and performance just doesn't convey that. Neeson sounds like he just wants to get the recording session over with. Even the peerless Malcolm McDowell, who appears late in the game as a key character, sounds disinterested. It's not really the actor's fault. They've got nothing to work with. Acting is reacting, and they're being asked to feel something and emote in a recording studio with very little context. Notes on the character, maybe a director giving them ideas, but remember also this is early on in the Fallout story and the first cinematic game, so there's not a lot to base your performance on. It really highlights just how far we've come when you consider the high quality of voice acting and dialogue in games like Cyberpunk and Baldur's Gate 3. And reinforces the difference in quality between a TV show where everything hinges on an actor's performance and games where the actor's performance is usually a secondary concern. There were very few characters I felt a connection to, maybe the super mutant Forks, who can join you later, but really he has a leg up because he's a big ugly brute with a heart of gold and everyone loves that archetype. Conversation is never really interesting for its own sake, relying upon the patented Bethesda zoom in on a talking head, which is bordering on the comical at this point. Actually, it was comical 5 years ago. I was amazed when it returned for Starfield. That game really made me feel like someone must have a bet on at Bethesda for how long they can get away with that kind of thing. My intention with these retrospectives is to reflect upon the periodic desire I have to return to these much-loved games, to consider whether my opinion has changed at all, and to see how they fit in the ongoing history of video games. I do think that a narrative has developed that is unfair with regards to Fallout 3. Whether this is because of a resurgent interest in traditional top-down CRPGs, or because of some perceived mistakes Bethesda has made in the direction of some of its games, I can't say, but I do think it's unfair. At the time Fallout 3 released, it was bold, taking a much-loved series and attempting to update it, keeping it relevant for an increasingly demanding public that would no longer settle for a fixed-camera, isometric game world. It drops the ball in terms of characterization and fails in its attempt to create a believable world, but it creates a compelling and fun one, With so much content, it's hard to see how anyone could feel shortchanged. There is always something new to discover, and perhaps this is what I appreciated most from returning to Fallout 3. Honestly, I couldn't remember why I liked Bethesda games, and Fallout 3 reminded me of why, and for that alone, it was worth revisiting, and I think it would be worth revisiting for you if you're in two minds about it. If you've watched the TV show, I don't think it would be a bad move to start with Fallout 3. Something more modern perhaps would be the more logical choice, Fallout 4 first. But it's not so whiplash inducing jumping into Fallout 3, particularly once you have the context, you're interested in the world, you maybe played Fallout 4, you've played 76. Is it worth playing Fallout 3? Will it illuminate my understanding of the world? Will I enjoy playing through it? Absolutely. It's not a bad game. Don't believe that kind of narrative that has grown up that it should be ignored. It shouldn't be ignored. New Vegas has some better characters and I think a more compelling story, but that doesn't mean Fallout 3 is worthless. It's definitely not. It's a very interesting game, and if you're interested in the history of games and following series from start to finish, you should not skip Fallout 3. Play it. Thanks for watching, guys. I've been Napyet. Do sub up and like and let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you next time.